They told you she was saved by a kiss, a prince, a spell, true love breaking a curse. But in the original story, Sleeping Beauty was never kissed awake. She never even woke up. She was found alone in a silent castle, unconscious, and a king, already married, discovered her. What happened next was never meant for bedtime. No magic, no romance, no consent. And it didn't end there. While she lay asleep, she gave birth to twins. And when the king's jealous wife found out, she ordered the children killed, cooked, served at dinner. This is not a horror film. This is the earliest recorded version of Sleeping Beauty. So the real question is, why did they turn this into a children's fairy tale? Why did centuries of storytellers erase the violence, soften the cruelty, paint it pink? What were they trying to hide? To understand the truth, we have to go back over 400 years. 400 years before Disney, before the Brothers Grimm, before the idea of happily ever after. There was a man named Giambattista Basile, a Neapolitan courtier, a soldier, a collector of stories whispered in marketplaces and royal halls. In 1634, 2 years after his death, his work was published in a collection called the Pentamerone, one of the earliest recorded compilations of European fairy tales. Hidden inside it was a story called The Sun, Moon, and Talia. This is the first known version of Sleeping Beauty, and it is nothing like the one you know. Talia is the daughter of a great lord. At her birth, astrologers and wise men gathered to predict her fate. Their prophecy is precise. She will be endangered by a splinter of flax. Not a spinning wheel, not a curse from a fairy, just flax. Years later, while wandering through her father's palace, Talia sees an old woman spinning. Curious, innocent, sheltered, she touches the fibers. A tiny splinter slips beneath her fingernail, and instantly, she collapses. No dramatic curse, no magical green flames, just silence. Her father, devastated, cannot bear to bury her. Instead, he places her body in one of his country estates, seated on a velvet throne, and abandons the palace to grief. She is not dead, but she does not wake. Days pass, months, years. One day, a passing king, already married, is hunting nearby. His falcon flies into the abandoned palace. He follows it inside, and there, in a quiet chamber, he finds Talia, still beautiful, still unmoving, still silent. He tries to wake her. He calls to her, but she does not respond. And what happens next is where the fairy tale shatters. He takes advantage of her unconscious body, then he leaves and returns to his kingdom, as if nothing happened. No true love, no promise, no rescue, just abandonment. Months later, still asleep, Talia gives birth to twins. Yes, while unconscious. Servants secretly care for the infants. They nurse at her body instinctively. One day, one of the twins begins to suck on her finger, searching for milk. Instead, the child pulls the splinter of flax from beneath her nail. And in that moment, Talia awakens, not to a prince's kiss, but to motherhood, to confusion, to two children she does not remember conceiving. She names them Sun and Moon, and begins raising them inside the same palace where she was left. When the king eventually returns and sees her alive, he is astonished. He falls in love with her beauty again. But there is a problem. He already has a wife, and she is about to discover everything, because the horror doesn't stop here. When the king returns to his kingdom, he does not return as a hero. He returns as a husband, and husbands in royal courts are watched. His queen begins to notice something has changed. He is distracted, restless, dreaming. Eventually, the truth slips out. There is another woman, and there are children, 2 of them, hidden away in a distant palace. In 17th century courts, betrayal was not simply romantic, it was political. Children meant heirs. Heirs meant threats. Threats meant war inside the family. The queen does not scream. She does not confront him. She plans. She summons a trusted servant, calmly, coldly. She instructs him to travel to the remote palace and retrieve the children, sun and moon. Then she gives a second command: kill them and bring their bodies to the royal kitchen. She wants them prepared, cooked, served to their own father. This is not metaphor. It is written plainly in the original tale. The servant leaves, but when he sees the children, something in him breaks. They are innocent, laughing, alive. He cannot do it, so instead he hides them with his wife and slaughters 2 young animals to deceive the queen. The meat is prepared, seasoned, placed before the king at dinner. Imagine the scene: a candlelit hall, silver plates, goblets of wine. The queen watches her husband as he eats. She studies his face, waiting. He compliments the meal. He asks for more. She leans forward and whispers, "You are eating what is yours." The king freezes, but she doesn't mean what he thinks she means. She believes he has consumed his own children. There is no horror in her voice, only satisfaction. Power restored, revenge complete. But the servant's deception will not remain hidden. Eventually, the truth spills out. The children are alive. The king is furious, and the queen's cruelty is exposed. In Basile's version, justice is swift and brutal. The queen is executed, burned. The story ends not with redemption, but with punishment and survival. This was the first recorded Sleeping Beauty, a tale of abandonment, of exploitation, of attempted cannibalism. And we tell this story to children, or at least a softened version of it. The truth is unsettling. Fairy tales were not written to comfort. They were written to warn, to reflect a world where power was dangerous, women were vulnerable, and royal families were battlegrounds. This was never meant to be gentle. It was meant to be remembered. And yet, this wasn't even the darkest version. More than 60 years after Basile's version, the story resurfaced in a different country, under a different pen, in a completely different political climate. This time, it was written by Charles Perrault, a respected member of the French court. In 1697, he published a collection of tales that would shape the fairy tales we recognize today. Among them was Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. But this was not Naples. This was France, under the dazzling and carefully controlled reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Versailles was not a place for grotesque scandal. It was a stage. Everything was curated: fashion, speech, etiquette, even morality. Stories were no longer just folklore whispered in villages. They were performed in aristocratic salons, read aloud to noble women, debated by intellectuals. And so, Sleeping Beauty had to change. Perrault removes the assault entirely. There is no unconscious violation, no disturbing ambiguity, no king acting without consequence. Instead, we are given a curse placed on a princess by an offended fairy. A spindle replaces flax. A prophecy replaces fate. And when the princess falls into a 100-year sleep, she is not abandoned in shame. She is protected. A forest grows around the castle. Time itself seems to pause. Then comes the moment that reshaped the myth forever. The prince does not take. He waits. He approaches, he kneels, and she awakens. In Perrault's version, it is implied that she wakes at the arrival of the prince, whether by kiss or destiny, and the moment is framed as romantic inevitability. Consent is restored. Love is emphasized. The narrative is cleaned. Sleeping Beauty becomes less about danger and more about patience and reward. But here is where it becomes unsettling. Perrault does not remove the cannibalism. After the princess awakens and marries the prince, the story continues. And this is the part many modern retellings quietly omit. The prince's mother is not merely jealous. She is an ogress, not metaphorically cruel, but literally monstrous. When the prince leaves for war, he entrusts his wife and children to his mother's care. A fatal mistake. The ogress queen soon grows hungry, not for power, for flesh. She orders the young children killed and prepared for her dinner. When that fails, she demands the princess herself be slaughtered and served. Perrault keeps this horror intact. He softens sexual violence, but preserves maternal cannibalism. Why? Why would a refined French court sanitize one brutality, yet cling to another? The answer may lie in what 17th century France feared most. Open scandal, especially sexual, could stain reputations, destabilize alliances, and threaten noble lineage. Stories presented in aristocratic salons needed moral polish. The king must appear noble. Romance must be elevated. But the ogress? She represents something different. She is the foreign threat, the dangerous older generation, the devouring force that consumes the young. In a court obsessed with succession, inheritance, and bloodlines, the fear of being swallowed by one's own family was deeply symbolic. Perrault reshapes the story to fit his audience. He removes what is socially unacceptable. He keeps what is politically useful. And so Sleeping Beauty evolves, not into innocence, but into propaganda wrapped in lace, which leads to a deeper question. If France carefully edited this story for its royal salons, what else was being rewritten? And what does it say about the fears of the time, that cannibalism survived the edit, but assault did not? By the time the story reaches Germany in the early 19th century, Europe has changed again. Empires are shifting. The Enlightenment has passed. Industrialization is beginning. And childhood, for the first time in history, is being redefined as something sacred. In 1812, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm published the first edition of Children's and Household Tales. Among the stories is their version of Sleeping Beauty, titled Little Briar Rose. And here the transformation is complete. No assault, no ogre queen, no cannibal banquet, just a curse, a spinning wheel, 100 years of sleep, and a prince destined to arrive at the perfect moment. In the Grimm version, when the princess pricks her finger, the entire castle falls asleep with her. The king, the queen, the servants, even the flies on the wall. The world pauses. A thick hedge of thorns grows around the castle, swallowing it from view. Many princes attempt to break through, but they fail. Some even die on the thorns. Until one arrives at exactly the 100th year. This time the thorns part willingly. The prince does not force his way inside. The castle simply opens to him. He walks through silent halls, finds the princess, kisses her, and she wakes. So does everyone else. The curse is broken. Wedding bells follow. The end. Simple, clean, romantic. But this was not accidental. By the early 1800s, Europe was entering what would later shape Victorian morality, an era obsessed with purity, virtue, domestic order, and strict social roles. Sexuality became taboo in public storytelling. Female innocence became idealized. Literature for children was emerging as its own category, and publishers began marketing fairy tales specifically to young readers. The Grimms themselves edited their own stories across multiple editions. Early versions of their tales were far darker, but with each reprint, they softened them, removed sexual implications, strengthened Christian morals, punished villains more clearly, rewarded virtue more explicitly. Sleeping Beauty becomes less about danger and survival and more about patience and destiny. The princess is passive, untouched, preserved in innocence. The prince is brave, chosen, and morally pure. It fits perfectly into a society teaching young girls obedience and young boys heroism. But beneath that polished surface, something ancient remains: the sleep, the waiting, the isolation behind thorns. Because fairy tales were never just fantasy. They were warnings. Warnings about growing up too soon. Warnings about curiosity. Warnings about danger hiding inside ordinary objects. Like a spindle, they taught children how to behave in a world that was often cruel. The curse says, "Be careful." The thorns say, "The world is dangerous." The kiss says, "Salvation will come, but only if you are worthy." What began in Italy as a brutal tale of exploitation, what was reshaped in France as courtly drama, is now transformed in Germany into moral instruction. Not because the darkness disappeared, but because society decided children should not see it. The question is, did the horror vanish? Or was it simply buried beneath roses? By the time we strip away the romance, the gowns, the glittering castles, what remains is a story about a girl whose life is decided for her. Sleeping Beauty may look like a love story, but historically it reads like a warning. Many scholars interpret the curse as a metaphor for female puberty. A young girl pricks her finger, blood is drawn, and suddenly her childhood ends. She is no longer a daughter under protection. She becomes a body watched, guarded, and controlled. The sleep can symbolize isolation during this transition, a period where innocence is preserved until marriage. Then there is the reality of arranged marriage culture. For centuries, royal daughters were political currency. Their marriages secured alliances, prevented wars, strengthened kingdoms. Love was irrelevant. Choice was non-existent. A princess did not decide when she would marry. Prophecy, family, or politics decided for her. Sleeping Beauty does not choose the spindle. She does not choose the sleep. She does not choose the prince. Everything happens to her. Even the timing of her awakening is predetermined. In many royal courts, daughters were raised not as individuals, but as future treaties. Their worth was tied to obedience and fertility. In earlier versions of the tale, that reality is brutally exposed. In later versions, it is softened into romance. Some historians even suggest the prolonged sleep echoes collective trauma. Outbreaks of plague, unexplained illnesses, or burial rituals where the line between death and life felt frighteningly thin. Entire villages could seem to fall asleep under disease. Fear of premature burial haunted Europe for centuries. Seen this way, the castle frozen in time becomes something eerie, a society suspended between life and death, waiting for rescue. And that leads to the uncomfortable question beneath all versions of the story. What if Sleeping Beauty wasn't a love story, but a story about control? Control over women's bodies, control over inheritance and bloodlines, control over when a girl becomes a woman. The kiss may look romantic, but the sleep came first. By the time the story reaches Hollywood, the transformation is complete. In 1959, Disney releases Sleeping Beauty, and with it, centuries of darkness are quietly erased. There is no assault, no cannibal queen, no political manipulation, no disturbing aftermath. Princess Aurora is graceful, innocent, almost weightless. The curse is theatrical, cast by a single, clearly defined villain, Maleficent. Evil is no longer human or systemic. It is magical, external, and easily identifiable. The sleep becomes beautiful, the castle glows, the fairies sparkle. Even danger is stylized. The prince fights a dragon, defeats evil, kisses the princess, and everything resolves in a burst of light and orchestral triumph. There is no trauma to process, No uncomfortable questions about consent. No commentary on arranged marriage or female vulnerability. Just romance. Just destiny. Just happily ever after. What began in 1634 as a brutal reflection of power, sexuality, and survival has been reshaped into a pastel-colored fantasy safe for Saturday mornings. This is not just adaptation, it is cultural polishing. The nightmare was painted pink. Sleeping Beauty didn't begin as a love story. It began with exploitation, with attempted cannibalism, with power struggles hidden inside royal walls. Over time, each generation reshaped it, softening the violence, polishing the romance, turning survival into destiny, from assault to cannibalism to courtly romance to children's fantasy. The story didn't change by accident, it changed to make us comfortable. So ask yourself, what other stories were rewritten? What truths were buried beneath happily ever after? If you want to uncover the dark origins behind the tales you thought you knew, subscribe and follow this channel. We don't just tell stories, we reveal what history tried to hide. Because the next time you hear Once Upon a Time, remember, it wasn't always beautiful.